Let's get started. Good afternoon. Welcome to all of you, and welcome to all of you who are joining us live stream. So as you know, these days, there are as many people who are joining live stream as the large audience that we have here. It's a great privilege and a pleasure for me and for the center to have Kristalina Georgieva come and join us this afternoon for a conversation that will be wide-ranging and will be made even more wide-ranging by the interventions that I hope we'll be able to get from you as you ask any questions. I don't want to spend much time introducing her except to say that, I think in a way, if you want to look at somebody who is an embodiment of why the multilateral system works and what it can deliver, Kristalina is it, because she has worked in the World Bank and doing very many different things, most recently there as the Chief Executive Officer there. Before that, different roles in the European Commission, both as a commissioner and as the Vice President responsible for managing the human side and the financial side of the European Commission. And now since last October at the IMF. So having been here 3 months or a little over, we thought this would be a great time to invite her to come and share with us not just her views about the world economy and the issues that face the membership of the fund, but also how she sees the role of the IMF and how it is going to evolve in the decade to come. So, Kristalina, welcome. It's a great pleasure for me to have you here. I thought maybe the best thing would be to really just start by asking you, just back from Davos, you've had a chance to look at the fund's most recent global forecast that came out in earlier this month. Last year wasn't a very good year for developing countries and for the world as a whole, and this year actually doesn't look a whole lot better. So maybe get your sense of the outlook and risks first, and then we can take it from there.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me here. Very well-deserved of its reputation, Center for Global Development. I have been on this stage many times, but it is the first time I'm here as the managing director of the IMF. And you're right to start from, okay, you come from Davos, what's the news? First, for those who followed Davos in previous years, the mood was better than it was a year ago. Last year, most of those in Davos were quite pessimistic about the world economy, and there was fear of recession knocking on the door. And now we can say we are in a better place. We are in a better place than last January, and we are actually in a better place than in October when we presented the World Economic Outlook here in DC. And I must say, it was a difficult message from our side to deliver in Davos. Why? Because on one side, we have slightly downgraded our forecast for 2020 and 2021, but on the other side, we were in a more optimistic posture. So let me start from explaining how that works. So our forecast in Davos for 2019 downgraded from 3 to 2.9%, for 2020 from 3.4 to 3.3, and exactly the same for the next year from 3.5 to 3.4. Main reason, a very small group of countries, among them one big one, having been downgraded. India is the big one, abrupt slowdown in economic activities, and then a range of countries where unrest in 2019 has dragged their growth prospects down, from Hong Kong to Chile to Lebanon, to Ecuador. We have seen that repeatedly, and actually this is a phenomenon to watch in the future. Why we are saying we are in a better place? One, because trade tensions have receded. We have the US-China deal. There has been a more positive talk about relations between US and the European Union. And trade tensions were and still are a major factor bringing growth prospects down. Now, that is being eased. Two, and the two is very important for those who are skeptical about monetary policy's role in these years. Central banks have been accommodative. 49 of them cut interest rates 71 times. And that has given a boost to growth non-insignificant, about 0.5 percentage point, meaning that for 2019, that made the difference between possibly recession and no recession, 2.9 versus possibly 2.4. The third reason for more optimistic posture, if you look at the data, industrial output, trade seem to be bottoming out. But we still have a fairly anemic growth prospect. I mean, 3.3 is not something to celebrate widely. And since we presented our outlook, China has been hit by coronavirus. It has spread not wildly, but it is found now in 18 countries. WHO has announced a global emergency. That may be a factor of higher or smaller proportion, too early to say. However, it is not too early to say that we live in a more shock-prone world. I was reflecting over there in Davos. We are still in January. It is not even the end of January. We had forest fires in Australia, very dramatic. We had Middle East tensions with Iran. Thank God they had receded. And now we have a health emergency that could be significant. The point is that we live in a world with more uncertainty, and this is what I want to project on all of us. We have to be fast and agile in this more uncertain world. The second big thing in Davos, and the second for many of us is long in the waiting and really welcome, is the focus on climate action. Very clearly a dominant theme in Davos. How many of you are interested in climate and follow fairly? Wow, look at this. So we also, just before going to Davos, Larry Fink's letter. I had the privilege to spend quite a lot of time with him, including sitting like this in a dialogue, in the leadership dialogue. And it is for real. Here is a $7 trillion now making a shift from whatever to low carbon and climate resilient investment. And I for one am quite optimistic. I think the tide is turning on climate. Mother Nature has helped us tremendously, but also just economic rationale. We at the fund take this very much to heart. We are focusing on two areas of our comparative strength: fiscal, carbon price, carbon tax, fiscal buffers, and financial risks related to climate, disclosure of these risks, stress testing of the financial system for both transitional risks, in other words, investments moving from high carbon to low carbon, and risks related to natural disasters. The third thing in Davos that I actually missed, in other words, it should have been there, but it wasn't so much, is the topic of inequality. The year before, it was much more present. This year, not that it wasn't present, but it felt a bit like it has taken a backstage, and it shouldn't, because going back to the issue of unrest, going to our research at the fund that says evidence is that when inequalities grow, that impacts negatively growth. It should be more present than it was. And one thing that I also would say, there is continuous discussion around gender equality. It was there in Davos. A bit more women to meet when you go around, but by far not enough. To draw the line, very well attended. We had a very big US delegation, as you know. President Trump was there with a large number of cabinet members. Quite well attended from the business side, and very well attended by climate activists. And of course, the fund was there.
Good. So I think one of the things that you've just mentioned, the outlook, and then the focus on climate. And I want to pivot a bit from climate in the broad to the impact of climate on those countries that are particularly
Vulnerable.
hard placed to respond to it. Some of the poorest, most vulnerable countries. And we know from all the analysis that they're going to be hard hit and that it will aggravate some of the difficulties that people already have in being able to make a good livelihood. And from that, a little bit more broadly into sort of the difficulties facing fragile states and Africa. And I want to get a little bit your sense of how you see the fund's role. You talked a bit about the fund's role in climate, but the fund's role in helping the poorest countries and fragile states, and just maybe one thing, you know this, but it's worth saying that there have been a number of reports done by other institutions, including the Independent Evaluation Office of the Fund, talking about the fund's role in fragile states. And they say the fund has done some good things, but they also point out to some things that the fund hasn't been able to do that others think it should. So you've been there a while. You've had a chance to, of course, work with many of these countries in the past. How do you see the fund's work in this set of countries, and where do you think it might go going forward?
Well, one of the first things I read when I was nominated was the Independent Evaluation Office report on fragile states. And one of the first board meetings I chaired was on actions we are taking to implement the recommendations. Why? Because for every institution, it is easier to work with the countries that do well. And you were at the fund, you know that for fund staff, it is a badge of honor to be a mission chief for a G7 country or for an up-and-coming country. And it is more difficult to motivate institutions and individuals in these institutions to focus on what is hard, where the probability of failure is higher than the probability of success. How do you motivate your staff going and saying, you know what, I really want you to take on that responsibility. Most likely, you will be working on it for the next 5 years, and not much would happen. So I find, and as you know from my work at the bank, At the same time, we need to recognize these are the countries that need institutional support the most. These are the countries where the fund, the World Bank, ought to be most present, because these other countries that are doing well, they probably can manage more or less on their own. Yes, they can benefit of this transmission line of experience. They probably would do better with it than without it. But it is the Horn of Africa, the Sahel, Central African Republic, or Yemen, where support to get out of a very difficult place is critical. We take action on 3 counts. One, very important, to build stronger human and financial capacity for engagement with these countries. And that means we are also looking into how we can shift more towards fragile states. 2, lifting it up in the eyes of staff. The very first meeting I had at the fund was with the Africa department. It wasn't by chance. It was because I wanted to say, I start from where we matter the most. Since I took the helm of the fund, by the way, Christine has done a great job to bring the fund forward in this direction. This is a message that I communicate. And then 3, to recognize that in the end, the most exciting thing is to demonstrate that success, even in the most difficult of circumstances, is possible, and then celebrate this success. So I'll give you 2 examples. One is a focus on a country that has gone through terrible decades of conflict, Somalia. It is now a moment to help Somalia turn a page, get out of this pariah status it has with no ability to work with organizations like the fund. We are very confident that we are going to have, in the next 2 months, finally, a decision that would close the book on arrears of Somalia to the IMF, and we will scale up significantly our work in Somalia. Anybody here following on Somalia? Well, that is actually a point I'm trying to make. These are the countries that need more attention because they're not necessarily a center of it. Second case, Ethiopia. Very dynamic prime minister, a country that is finally taking on critical reforms. Again, an opportunity to turn a new page. And we are stepping up. We are going to have a $2.9 billion program. This is a very large program by any standard. And we want to do, understand there is a higher risk, but it is also such a tremendous opportunity. If you think of Africa, Nigeria, Ethiopia, DRC, South Africa, the big economies that can either lift up Africa or hold it back. And one of them, Ethiopia today, is on the verge of being that agent for itself and also for for Africa as a whole. So the short and the long is that we do much more analytics on risks, climate risks, also conflict risks, and we do much more in terms of engagement on capacity development and on motivating staff to take these jobs. Badge of honor, take it, great for your career.
Well, more power to you for doing that. I see Antoinette is sitting in the front row there, and between Antoinette and me, when I was at the fund, we used to, between us, I think, cover pretty much most of the fragile states in the world. And I think all the issues that you've raised are exactly the ones that have held us back from being able to do all the things that we could do. And I hope that under your leadership, we'll be able to actually help those countries and also make it clear that being able to do a good job in a fragile state actually requires a set of skills and a degree of expertise that isn't necessarily there, that is needed to be able to analyze the balance sheets of a small European country. So I think this is a different but much more complicated business. I want to maybe just ask you one more question, then open it up. And that's, you started talking a little bit about how you're trying to get the staff and the fund as an organization to think differently about Africa, about fragile states. I know you're doing the same about climate. One of your hallmarks, if you like, from your previous career has been that you not only bring your own energy and agenda to the task, but you also are able to bring about institutional change. And of course, the fund has a very strong culture. You have been there now only a few months, but in a way, if you look at the fund as an organization now, and you think about all the comparators around, and you look at the changes in the world, if you look at how artificial intelligence is changing the business of economic forecasting, if you look at the gender profile of the leadership of the fund, and you sort of project out, what would you like to see different in this organization 5 years from now, that you would say, this is what I would like done a little bit differently?
Let me first say that it is a great place to work, and an incredibly disciplined and high-performing organization. I was asked in Davos, how was the new job? So my answer, I sleep less, I work more, and I love it. It's fantastic. So what I want is to contribute to the fund as my predecessor did. And it is to raise the bar even higher. It is a great organization in a fast-changing world, and therefore it has to lean forward so it can be ahead, not behind of times. And one thing that I want us to unite around is actually very simple, that we always think of our work to be about people. Policies are for people. Thinking about the implication of policy choices on everyone, but especially on those in society that are more vulnerable, more at risk to fall behind. This I want to be in the fund's DNA. I actually came up with, so we are an institution with great reputation, and I want people to think of the fund in the following way, that it is hard-headed and soft-hearted at the same time. And to be, when I think of where we would be headed with our team at the fund, is more horizontal integrity of leadership, more sense of owning everything we do. You may be in dealing with fiscal affairs or on the front line in Somalia, but we are all one team and have this unity of purpose to improve the lives of people on the foundation of sound economic policies. How the fund would look like in 5 years, I can tell you for sure we would look like the world around us. Right now, we don't yet quite, Christine did a great job on gender equality. She moved the fund. And I'm going to take it from her and move it further. Equality means equality. We today have, when I started, we had 25% women in senior positions. We are now 29, almost 30%. We moved a little. That is not parity. This is not equality. So we have some way to go. And I also want to see the young people in the fund being much more engaged in debates in a more direct way. We are more, I wouldn't say hierarchical, because actually there is a great engagement, but still we do have a transmission line up and down that sometimes makes the young economists in the fund feeling a bit excluded from the big discussions, and that we, of course, can change. I can tell you I started the day today with a discussion on modernization. All our senior team, the directors and the deputy managing directors and myself, with those who lead the modernization. And I was very encouraged by the seriousness of participation of everybody. People own it. Now, we also shared some data. 84% of those surveyed in the fund believe that modernization is necessary. 65% are not sure that there is commitment to really modernize. In other words, they're sitting on the bench waiting to see which way we would go. And so obviously we have to go the right way. And that absolutely would happen. We need institutions like the fund that are able to be a transmission line of experience from the best to those with highest degree of difficulty. And we are doing that really well. And the evidence that we are doing as well is that, again, today, so here is one day of the managing director. Today, I also met with the ambassador of Andorra, a country that is applying to be our 190th member.
Oh, good luck to Andorra as the latest member of the IMF.
Well, they are still to fill all the requirements, but they have formally requested membership.
Very good. All right, I'm going to open it up, and I'm sure there are people who have questions. So I'm going to take a few at a time, starting with the lady sitting in the second row here, and then I'm going to come to you and then to you.
Yes, thank you. My name is Val Okaru-Baisant. I'm a professor at Catholic University, and my question, actually I'm having a disclaimer here because my views are not those of Catholic University. Thank you so much for a very candid and down-to-earth answer to the questions asked, Kristalina. I had a question specifically on inequality, and I know you addressed that internally you'll be looking at addressing the gender inequality, but just in terms of the role of the IMF and looking ahead, how will you be addressing the question of inequality, especially economic inequality, youth, the youth bulge, especially in Africa? I know you mentioned fragile regions, but that seems to be a very, very critical issue. It's been considered a ticking time bomb. And then secondly, you mentioned, this is the last question, climate risks, conflict risks, and financial risks. But I wanted to also ask you a question, given the exigencies of the shift in landscape, the global landscape, can you please address the geopolitical risks, or what I call the geopolitical uncertainties that we're facing? What do you see the role of the IMF, given the exigencies of that? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And then I've got a gentleman right there behind you, Abby, just over there. Yep, thank you.
Thank you so much for a good discussion. My name is Henry Huang, and I am a part of the Asian Development Bank here in Washington, D.C. My question is regarding on the Chinese economy right now. As we have seen in the recent years, Chinese economy is slowing down, and the ongoing coronavirus is slowing down Chinese economy, especially in the service and transportation sector. And we also have seen other transportation and tourism declining in other major economy in Asia Pacific region, such as Thailand. How would IMF respond to the potential damage it would create to the international economy as a whole, especially to the first quarter of 2020? Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you very much. And then the third one was that gentleman right over there. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Brad Johnson with Resource Mobilization Advisors. We're an international developer of clean energy projects. Congratulations to you and to IMF for the great work you do. I think the general public doesn't really fully appreciate the importance of IMF. My question goes to the intersection of climate change and IMF policies. 2 years ago, we were working in Jamaica with the National Water Commission, which is the single largest energy consumer in Jamaica. And we were advancing an energy efficiency program that would reduce their energy consumption, which would be good for them and good for the country and good for their balance of payments. And we had a third party coming in offering to provide a guarantee. So if they promised $1 million in savings and they didn't produce it, they'd pay the difference to the government. We still ran into problems with IMF because IMF found a contingent, rightfully so, a contingent liability to the government, although very thin. My question is, would you be willing to have your staff convene a meeting with some developers to talk about a general policy you could develop, not an ad hoc country by country, but a general policy on these kinds of issues and initiatives?
Thank you very much. So we have three quite broad questions
Yes.
here. Yep. Or four, actually.
Actually, four. Yes. So let me start by giving credit to Christine Lagarde and the team of the IMF for focusing on the issue of inequalities over the last years. And that led to a new strategy, social spending strategy, that was adopted by the board of directors of the IMF last year, saying that there has to be protection of social spending and there has to be attention to inequalities. The staff of the IMF has done very interesting and valuable research recently on how inequalities and the financial sector interface, and I presented it in the Peterson Institute just weeks ago, and also on what is the relation between taxation and inequalities. Could more progressive taxation undermine growth, or could be actually neutral or positive for growth? All of this research is factored in the way we do our work. The most important part is that with the social spending, we are providing very clear guidance to our teams, our mission chiefs and the country teams, on how they should carefully assess their recommendations with regard to the impact on increasing inequalities, the risk of increasing inequalities. And to your specific question on youthful, population growth in many developing countries, what I'm asking our teams to do more of in our surveillance work when we assess each economy, and especially in our program work and capacity development work, to always ask two questions. Where is growth coming from? Where are jobs coming from? It is not normally the instinct of our teams, because their preoccupation is protect financial stability as a precondition for growth. But it ought to be. Why? Because growth has been anemic, and because we have countries with rapidly growing populations where jobs are not necessarily abundant. And I also can tell you that we work and we want to work more with the World Bank teams, with the teams of development institutions, where there is more expertise in this area so we can integrate it in our own work. On geopolitical risks, what we do is to provide evidence to decision makers based on objective presentation of facts. And what staff of the IMF excels in is the ability to crunch numbers and make projections. Geopolitical tensions are a factor in projections we make, whether growth is going to accelerate or decelerate. While we are not obviously a political actor, and we are actually prohibited by our Articles of Agreement to engage in political activities, we are a very good observer to show what the implications could be, and then to translate those implications beyond the individual countries into what does it mean for a region, what does it mean for the world. When I was a very determined and obsessed reader of IMF reports, because of this uniqueness of the IMF, to look at each and every country, rich and poor, small, big, and have that access to data, actually mandatory delivery of data, and ability to paint a picture at the country level, regional level, and the whole world. In that sense, when we look at, say, the Middle East, we would be looking at the economics of the Middle East, but of course it is informative on the geopolitical dynamics in the Middle East. China is undergoing a medium-term process of or rather transition from high speed to high quality growth. In other words, they recognize that the days of the 10-12% growth over. China is going to a slower growth, and so far it has been quite good in making sure that this is a process, a relatively smooth process for China itself and for the rest of the world. We need to remember that China is very significant for everyone just because of its own size. It has been also consistently focusing on reforms as an engine to retain growth and to increase the quality of growth, including most recently opening up of the financial sector, something that is not an easy step for China. We actually upgraded our forecast for China just in January because of the reduction of trade tensions. So we had a projection for 2020 5.8 for China. We lifted it up to 6%. Now comes the coronavirus. It would be irresponsible to offer any speculations around what may happen. What I can do is refer to a similar case of SARS, the SARS epidemics. What happened then was indeed a slowdown in the short term and then rebouncing of economic growth. So over the course of a whole year, it kind of evened up. Would that be the case now? It is very hard to predict. It is a different type of epidemics in which what we recognize is that the symptoms are not so easily detectable. Yes, fever is a symptom, but it might come later after a number of days. The immediate impact is obvious. We have travel, tourism, manufacturing in China and a little bit beyond China in Asia being impacted. We also see that China is taking very dramatic measures to restrict the spread of the epidemics, and work is underway on a vaccine. So let's say for this quarter, very likely there would be some negative impact. What would happen beyond this quarter, we have to just observe and assess. But the broader point I want to make is that preparedness, prevention, early action, this has to get in the bloodstream of policymakers. It is, whether it is pandemics or a climate shock or geopolitical tension, we are living with more unpredictability. And then we have technological advancements. They could be a great thing, but they can also be disruption and dislocation of jobs with all the implications of it. My favorite saying these days is, enjoy the pace of change today. It will never be so slow in the future. To go to the I would respond to the last part of your question first. Yes, in principle, I'm very interested in having discussions that inform the positions and the policies we have. I'm not familiar with the specific case in Jamaica. I know that we had a very successful program with Jamaica that has built the economy up, and one of the cases when we actually do celebrate together with Jamaica. But this specific question on contingent liabilities, how we can promote climate action, this is something that I would welcome. If you have any suggestions for what format this kind of more inclusive discussion could take, you're very welcome to provide them. There is somebody here on the front row from my office. You can exchange cards and then we can follow up.
All right, let's do one more round of questions then. So I have a lady over there first, and then I'm going to take you next, and then I'll come to you next.
Hi, I'm Barbara Stallings from Brown University and Tsinghua University in Beijing. I have another China question, but a very different China question. You put a lot of emphasis in your comments, first on fragile states and then focusing in on Africa. The part of the world that's been especially involved in Africa in the last decade, 15 years or so, is China. And I'm wondering to what extent there has been or might be in the future any kind of a partnership between the fund and any part of the Chinese government in the particular context of Africa.
Yep.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then a second one here.
Thank you very much. I'm under.
Just wait for the
Mike.
microphones on your way so that others can hear you.
Thank you. I'm Ander Brand from Eri Platform, a civic society association that facilitates dialogue to reach common ground among diverse groups. Thank you very much for a very informative conversation. My question is, how can the fund help fragile states which do not help themselves? The first place, fragility, among other things, is a function of the absence of accountable, responsive governance. Also, dysfunctional institutions, like dysfunctional central banks, like in my country, Eritrea. How can the IMF help these countries? And what can the IMF do to encourage internal reforms so they can help themselves and be helped? Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's one in the back there, and then there was a lady over there that I wanted to get to forward.
Thank you. I'm Richard Seifman, a former bank staffer, but I worked on the financing chapter of the Global Pandemic Preparedness Monitoring Board results. And among the recommendations that were included in that report was that the IMF consider Article 4 risk assessment possibilities to look at preparedness by countries, and I was so glad to see you talk about preparedness.
All right, and then there's just that lady up there, Happy next to you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Elna Ben Sultan. I work for Swiss Re. We help governments and multilaterals and other public entities transfer and mitigate risk and mainly for natural disasters. So my question would be, could you elaborate a little bit more on what you said in the beginning on your role in the, on how you're planning on really making an impact in addressing this, natural disaster risks? Because not only fragile states, but also small states, right? Like small island states in the Pacific and the Caribbean are especially vulnerable, and they can be impacted, obviously, as you know, very much so. So I was just curious to hear a little bit more about specifically, if how you see,
Well, thank you all for this round of questions. We are already collaborating. By the way, I should say I cherish my own professorship at Tsinghua University 2000-2003. I was a guest professor there. So we already have partnership with China. And this partnership with China on, broadly speaking, cooperation on financing development outside of China is not limited to Africa, but of course Africa is a big part of it. Our focus is on two issues. One, debt sustainability. It is very important that as China expands its role, it does it in a manner that is respectful for debt-bearing capacity of countries. And debt transparency is also part of this work towards debt sustainability. And I can say that we have had both policy engagement as well as country-specific actions that we recommend to China with regard to bringing down debt levels to a sustainable position. And secondly, we work with China on how can they incorporate good policies in the way they engage with countries. Good policies in the areas where the fund has comparative strength, and it is financial sector development, the development of public policies that are relevant for sustainable long-term investments. My personal engagement first time was as part of the so-called 1+6. It is an engagement of 6 international organizations with the Chinese leadership. My take was one of responsible engagement, and that will, of course, continue. Today, debt levels in the world are dangerously climbing high. We came up with our new data, $188 trillion of debt. In the developing world, low-income countries, 43% of them are already at a dangerous level. It is our responsibility not just to ring the bell, the alarm bell, but also to give good recommendations to the countries themselves, to the borrowers, as well as to the lenders. Thank you for your question. So our work in fragile states obviously differs depending on the root causes of fragility. And when you look at why a country is fragile, it would be a combination of, broadly speaking, 3 things. One, fragility due to conflicts, internal or in the neighborhood. 2, fragility due to climate shocks. And unfortunately, far too many poor countries are on the receiving end frequently of these shocks. And the third reason is governance. We have far too many cases of countries that are poor for no good reason. I mean, Zimbabwe has no reason to be poor. Actually, Central African Republic has no reason to be poor. In the case of Zimbabwe, it is not a conflict. In the case of Central African Republic, there is also a conflict. Eritrea is a country that doesn't have to be poor if it is to have the right institutional framework and good governance. The more a country is interested in dealing with its problems, the likelihood of success goes up. In my country, we have a very good saying. You can take a horse to water, cannot make the horse drink. So we as institution make every effort possible to take the horse to water. Through good policy advice, through our surveillance work, through programs, if appropriate, through capacity development. But ultimately, of course, it is so very important what the country itself is willing to do for its people. On the risk assessment, the question you brought, I mean, it is more of stating the obvious that we do have to look at, sorry, let me step back. We look at risks mostly from a macro stability, financial stability standpoint. Obviously, if a country is ill-prepared to handle a higher probability risk or a low probability risk with devastating consequences, there cannot be macro stability, there cannot be financial stability secured. And therefore, we do look from the prism of macroeconomic stability, we do look at different categories of risks. I must admit, it doesn't mean that we are able to integrate each and every risk sufficiently. But we do think of informing our teams so they can take a good risk profile and therefore make an appropriate assessment. I will follow up on the recommendation that was done. I know that there was quite a focus. Every time when we have a pandemic, when we have a big shock somewhere, we wake up and then we do a little better. And the question is how we can internalize this a bit more. I can tell you much more in details how we look at climate, because this is something that we are, the last question that was asked, this is something that we believe is paramount for the role of the fund on macro stability. So our engagement is with the network of central banks that is concentrated on disclosure of climate-related financial risks. And in that network, our concentration is on defining how to report on these risks in a standardized manner. Obviously, we are in an early stage. Different countries apply different reporting frameworks. How can we get to a point when these reporting standards are harmonized? And then once reporting is being done, how can we stress test the financial sector in a country for these climate-related risks? I didn't know it before I took this job, but I take pride for the fund that this is the institution that came up with stress testing 20 years ago. So we stress test for the more conventional risks, financial risks, and now we need to step up a notch and be able to do stress tests for these two categories of climate risks. One, transitional risk. Take the European Union. Now they have a target 2050 carbon neutral. To reach this target, there will be a price on carbon everywhere in the European Union that would go up to an appropriate incentive level. But that means that investments in coal, in oil, they're going to become less and less profitable. And if you are a financial institution with a big share of these investments in your portfolio, this is clearly, for everybody who invests in this institution, a risk. And then we have the risks from climate shocks, and that these risks have been going up. As we know, the cost from climate disasters have been jumping up and up to a point that they are clearly significant risk from a financial sector perspective. The important thing to stress is that at the fund, I have no interest to step out of our mandate, which is macro stability, financial system stability, monetary policy. But like Christine Lagarde before me, I recognize that the world has changed. And there are macro-critical issues today that at the time of the birth of the IMF 75 years ago were not either present or relevant. Today they are. Climate is definitely relevant. Inequality, relevant. Fragility, relevant. Corruption, relevant. So we have to integrate them in our work and do it hard-headedly, but with a soft heart. So.
All right. Well, that seems to me to be an appropriate point on
stop.
which to bring this to closure. And I know there are a lot of people who still had questions. I'm sorry for not being able to get you all in, but we've run out of time, and that seemed like a sort of closing statement to me. So with that, let me just invite everybody to thank you, Kristalina, for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you.